Hi everyone, it's Tondi from Her Book Club. Right now we are in the month of February 2025, and this is North American Black History Month. And that is a month that has been around for a couple of decades where we celebrate the achievements and accomplishments and contributions of Black people in North American history. And with that in mind and keeping with the theme, I thought I'd come to you today and share with you some of my favorite books that deal with Black history, not just from America, but from throughout the diaspora. I feel that at this moment, with just in the political zeitgeist, with a lot of the anti-woke, anti-DEI sentiments, which in my opinion are very not so thinly veiled euphemisms for anti-Blackness and the erasure of history. I would really recommend and emphasize the importance of reading books around history with the focus and lens on the contributions of Black and African people in order to get a sound and more diverse understanding of the events in the past and how those represent our current day. So here are some of my favorite picks for Black History Month reading. And remember, Black History Month is technically every month, so you can pick up these books at any time of the year and read them at your own leisure. So first up, we have Baracoon, The Story of the Last Slave by Zora Neale Hurston, and she was an African-American anthropologist and writer. She also wrote the famous fiction novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And this is a book that is nonfiction, and she found a gentleman named Kojo who came from what was then called Dahomey, and he was one of the passengers in one of the last slave ships that came from the continent to America. And this book is, as I've said, non-fic. It's an interview style, it's journalistic style, where Zora Neale Hurston went to his home and you get to hear his story about how he was kidnapped from his village. He talks about his memories as a child and his passage through the Middle Passage, how he survived, his life during enslavement, and then his post-enslavement life where he, against all odds, survived and managed to build a family. And it's quite an endearing and vulnerable, touching retelling of the experience of enslaved African persons in America. Next up, I want to talk about one of the most famous African-American writers. His name was James Baldwin. He wasn't just a writer, he was a public speaker, as well as a social critic, essayist, activist, all of those things. I would like to talk about two of his books. So I've picked Notes of a Native Son as well as Another Country. So one nonfic and one fiction. Notes of a Native Son is a collection of essays and musings where Baldwin considers the state of African-American life, politics during the civil rights era, and what shaped the discourse at that time and the advancement of the Black cause. Another Country is a fiction novel set in Harlem, and it deals with jazz. It also deals with the economic and social decay that New York was experiencing at the time, and how in the period when he was talking about in the 1960s, of how the civil rights movement had gained traction, but there's still many social tensions that were being experienced at the time between Black people gaining more rights, as well as some of the wider economic challenges that were being experienced in the New York area, as well as, of course, the jazz scene. So those are two books by James Baldwin that I would recommend. Next up, I have, again, two books not by the same author, but about the same gentleman, and he is the famous Malcolm X. So this is the Autobiography of Malcolm X, which is pretty well known. I chose this one in conjunction with the biography of Malcolm X written by Manning Marable as a duo that should be read together. So this is the story from Malcolm X's own perspective, how his upbringing, and how his parents were Black activists. His mother came from the West Indian islands, and his father was an African-American follower of Marcus Garvey. So he did grow up in a very politically conscious household, and you can see that through line reflected in his later work and activities in the civil rights space. So it goes from him being a young child to his time as Detroit Red, when he was involved in criminal activity, and then post that when he moved to Harlem in New York and became the Malcolm X that we all know, particularly his work with the Nation of Islam. The biography by Manning Marable is supplementary to the autobiography, and it does add extra layers and textures to all the material that are covered in the autobiography by one of the gentlemen who was close to Malcolm X during his life. It adds context, of course, because it's not coming from the first person. There is more fact-checking that is in the book, and I enjoy this because it also focused a lot more on Malcolm X's missteps and how he was perceived in the public eye, as well as some of the surveillance that he was under from security forces. And as you will all know, Malcolm X was assassinated, and it spends a lot of time dealing with who assassinated him and why, and was it an inside job from the nation in the Nation of Islam. So I definitely would recommend reading these two together. As I've mentioned, Black history includes history from all across the diaspora and on the continent. So I would like to highlight this book by, it's a compilation by Irene Staunton of Weaver Press and Chiedza Musengezi. It's a Zimbabwean book called Tragedy of Lives, The Women in Prison in Zimbabwe. It's a book that was compilated with the real life experiences of different women who ended up incarcerated in Zimbabwe and what led them to get there. It's very good because it provides context, social, economic context of the challenges that African women have been facing in Zimbabwe from the pre-independence Rhodesian era to after independence. So issues of poverty, of abuse, of marriage, enforced marriages, child marriages, domestic violence. A very important read, one of the, I would say, most important books that Weaver Press Zimbabwe published. Right, next up, keeping in the theme of women in history, we have this very important book by Elizabeth Schmidt. She was an American historian and academic who used to work at the University of Zimbabwe. And this is Peasants, Traders, and Wives, Shona Women in the History of Zimbabwe from 1870 to 1939. So this is in the Rhodesian era. So just just at the cusp of colonialism to the colonial administration. And we often don't get an idea of what life was like before Zimbabwe was colonized. And this book is mostly dealing in the Mashonaland area, where we get a portrait of what were the social norms at that time for Zimbabwean women or Zezuru women in Mashonaland at that time, how the pioneer conquest of what then became to be Zimbabwe affected their lives. I think this one is very interesting because it talks about cultural norms such as marriage and lobola, aurora, which was bride wealth, and how some young women, one of the interesting stories that is in here is of how there were some young women who ran away from their families to join the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, in so doing, they would be able to escape forced marriages, as well as to get an education and the possibility to earn a little bit of money. So these are some of the stories that don't get talked about in history. And I really think it's an amazing read if you want to learn about our culture, our real culture and heritage, as well as just what women were experiencing, also the work that they did, and how some of the power that women could negotiate in the pre-colonial era was erased by the advent of colonialism. So that's a good one. Lastly, I have this one. It's part of the Down Memory Lane series, which was published by the Bulawayo Historical Society, which is no longer in existence, but they did produce some amazing historical works. And this is Some Famous Rhodesian Trials by Alan Hardy. It's a legal book, and he delves into some of the very controversial criminal trials in Rhodesian history. This one is a very good one. We've got issues to do with a scorned lover who kills her boyfriend. We have train robberies. We have a man who broke out of jail a reckoned amount of times during the Rhodesian era. We've got train heists. So very interesting book that looks at history from a different perspective. So if you're not really into reading facts and dates and everything, this one is a great one because it looks more so at what society was like and why the law was the way that it was at that time, and the different motivations for people to break the law and go outside of the legal confines and some of the consequences of that. So this is great, some famous Rhodesian trials by Alan Hardy. Yeah, so those are some of the books that I wanted to highlight, and tell me what books that you are reading for Black History Month, or some books that you think that I should be aware of, and let me know your thoughts. And if you've read any of the books I've highlighted, do you agree with some of my choices? Do you disagree? I love to hear your opinion.